On July 3rd, 1986, a woman in Bartow, Florida spent an evening hanging out at a local bar. At some point that night, she befriended a man and offered him a ride home. It's not exactly clear what happened that night, but one thing we do know for sure. Clemmy Jewel Arnold was murdered in cold blood that night. And 4 years later, her killer, still on the loose, decided to go for a hike on the Appalachian Trail. Flash forward to September 11th, 1990, and an Appalachian Trail Conservancy worker was surveying land along a roadwalk portion of the trail just outside of Duncannon, Pennsylvania. She noticed a rough-looking man walking along the trail, and something about him just gave her a bad feeling. He was wearing combat boots, a flannel, and carrying 2 red gym bags. He didn't look like a hiker. And because he was walking along the road portion of the trail after all, she figured it was just a coincidence. He was homeless and he was just drifting off to go hitchhike somewhere else along the roads. But then 2 hours later, further north along the roadwalk, she encountered him again. This startled her because it was now clear that this creepy man was in fact walking the AT, and he was just about to reach the portion of trail that leaves the road and re-enters back into the woods. The woman did nothing, however. I mean, what was she supposed to do after all? The man wasn't breaking any laws, and he seemed to be minding his own business. However, unbeknownst to her, this man was carrying a pistol and a 9-inch double-edged knife, and only 2 days later, he would use these weapons to commit one of the worst crimes in Appalachian Trail history. This is the tragic story of Molly LaRue and Geoff Hood, 2 thru hikers who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is a tough one, folks. It's a really sad story. I'm gonna get into it here, but real quick, I do just wanna ask you to please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. 80% of the people who have been viewing my videos lately are not subscribed. I recently passed 200,000 and I'm trying to get this channel to 300,000 next, so please hit that subscribe button. That would mean a lot. Okay, let's do it. On June 3rd, 1990, Molly LaRue and Geoff Hood climbed Mount Katahdin, which is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. The next day, they began walking south with ambitions of making it all the way to the end of the trail at Springer Mountain in Georgia. Like many AT thru hikers before and after them, their first few days out there were tough as they adjusted to life on the trail. LaRue wrote in her journal, quote, "We reminded one another before we started this ordeal that there would be tough days. Days we would ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Well, we had one of those days." But despite the difficult beginning, the couple trudged on and very quickly became more comfortable and confident in their hiking abilities. They even picked up trail names. Hood went by Clevis and LaRue by Nalgene. Geoff Hood was 26 years old and from Signal Mountain, Tennessee, and Molly LaRue was a year younger and from Shaker Heights, Ohio. They had met each other at a church-sponsored program in Salina, Kansas, where they both worked to take at-risk youths out on backcountry adventures. However, in the spring of 1990, they were both laid off from their jobs and decided to spend their now extra free time by taking on a thru hike of the Appalachian Trail. At one point, LaRue made a phone call to her father telling him about her plans to hike the trail, and it's at this point that she also announced that she had officially begun a relationship with Hood. The couple was moving at a slow but steady pace south, and by July 20th, they were almost done hiking through their second state, the state of New Hampshire. They continued south from here for over 600 miles before finally reaching the town of Duncannon, Pennsylvania, just shy of the halfway point on their hike. While in Duncannon, LaRue and Hood stayed at the Doyle Hotel, which is a famous spot for thru hikers to stop into. I stayed at the Doyle on my AT thru hike. I don't know how it was in 1990, but in 2018, it was charming for sure, but definitely a little bit run down. It did, however, have an awesome restaurant and bar on the ground floor, and I like to imagine that LaRue and Hood's time at the Doyle was similar to mine. I'm sure they stuffed themselves full of food, drank a few Yinglings, and then retired upstairs to their room to rest their weary bodies. There was one thing that was definitely different between their stay and mine, however, and that's because while they were at the Doyle, they called their parents and made plans to meet them in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, which is considered the psychological halfway point of the Appalachian Trail. Making it to Harpers Ferry is a major milestone for thru hikers. During these phone calls, they also informed their families that when they arrived in Harpers Ferry, they had something special to tell them. Hood's sister believes that they were going to announce their engagement. Tragically, however, whatever it is that the couple planned to tell their families will never be known. And that's because the couple never made it to Harpers Ferry. In fact, they hardly even made it out of Duncannon. The next day, September 12th, 1990, the couple had a leisurely morning, meeting up with a few of LaRue's relatives and running some trail errands. By 3:45 p.m., they finally headed back to the trail and began climbing up Cove Mountain. Because of the late start, the couple didn't make it far that day. They ended up hiking around 4 miles, and sometime after 5 p.m., they arrived at the now infamous Thelma Marks shelter. For the time being, they were the only ones there. Thelma Marks shelter has since been torn down, and in its place stands the Cove Mountain shelter a short distance away. I actually stopped at this shelter very briefly on my Appalachian Trail thru hike and took this video while I waited out a rainstorm. I had no idea that I was sitting in an area that had experienced an extreme act of evil some 28 years earlier. Like I said, LaRue and Hood were alone at first that evening, but at some point, either later in the night or even perhaps early the next morning, another man showed up. Little is known about what conversations, if any at all, occurred between the couple and this man. It's possible that he never even told them his name. However, within just a few weeks, every single hiker along the Appalachian Trail would know this man's name. It was Paul David Cruz, and he was wanted for murder. Paul David Cruz had a rough upbringing. He was abandoned as a child, and by age 8, he was adopted by a couple from North Carolina. He would often run away from home and even found himself getting in trouble with police. When he was only 12 years old, only 12, the cops caught him carrying a knife on his belt, which is not a good sign. During his senior year of high school, he dropped out and ran away once again, only to return later and finish school during the summer. It wasn't long after that Cruz joined the United States Marine Corps. In 1973, while still actively serving in the military, Cruz ended up marrying his high school sweetheart. But this new marriage and the structure and purpose given to people in the military was still not enough to set him on a good path. Only 2 weeks after getting married, Cruz attempted suicide and was admitted to a military hospital. 5 months later, he would go AWOL, and 2 months after that, he was discharged from the Marines, and a divorce soon followed. From here, Cruz bounced around to various places, doing various jobs, and eventually he did remarry another woman. However, this marriage didn't work out either. Cruz was a very unstable individual, and at one point he even put a knife to his second wife's throat and threatened to kill her. Obviously, this marriage also ended in a divorce, and by now it was crystal clear to those who knew him that Cruz was heading down a dark and violent path. This all came to a head in Florida in 1986. On July 3rd, 1986, Cruz killed Clemmy Jewel Arnold after she offered him a ride home from a bar one night. Authorities quickly found evidence that linked him to the murder and began pursuing him. However, he was able to evade them and eventually settled in South Carolina, where he just stayed under the radar for years. But then, for whatever reason, on September 5th, 1990, Paul David Cruz up and left South Carolina, caught a bus up to Virginia, and began hitchhiking even further north. He stopped in West Virginia, Maryland, and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and eventually he ended up near Duncannon, Pennsylvania, on the Appalachian Trail, more than 500 miles away from his home in Loris, South Carolina. On September 11th, 1990, an Appalachian Trail Conservancy worker was surveying land along a 16-mile stretch of road that the AT followed south of Duncannon, Pennsylvania. She noticed a homeless-looking man, a rough-looking man walking along the road there. but she assumed that he wasn't following the AT. It was just a coincidence that the trail followed the road in that part. She assumed this because the man didn't look like a hiker. He wore a flannel, jeans, and combat boots, and he was also carrying 2 red gym bags. He didn't have any typical hiking gear, and there was also a major highway nearby, and so she really didn't expect to see him again. She figured he would just hitchhike away, and that would be it. However, 2 hours later, on a further north portion of the roadwalk section of the AT, she saw this man again. And of course, as we all know, this man was Paul David Cruz. So at this point, she realized that he was, in fact, hiking on the Appalachian Trail. And this creeped her out, but there wasn't anything that she could do, obviously. At the end of the day, it was just a feeling. He hadn't bothered her, let alone threatened her in any way. And so she drove away, still with an uneasy feeling. And Cruz continued hiking north. And the next night, he arrived at Thelma Mark's shelter sometime either in the late evening or early morning after Molly LaRue and Geoff Hood were already there. And what happened next would go on to shock the Appalachian Trail community as well as just the nation as a whole for years to come. At some point between 5 and 7 a.m. on September 13th, Cruz brutally murdered LaRue and Hood using both a pistol and a knife. He also, I don't even know how to say this, you-know-whatted LaRue. I can't say the actual word because of YouTube's rules, but it starts with an R and it ends with an E. I'm pretty sure you can figure it out. It was an absolutely heinous, violent crime. Allegedly, Cruz was high on cocaine and he had drank a quart of liquor before he arrived at the shelter. He had no connection to the 2 slain hikers. It appears that they had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Later in the day, Cruz continued hiking north as if nothing had happened, except only this time, instead of carrying his 2 gym bags, he was now carrying a green Gregory backpack, the one that belonged to Hood. When he reached Duncannon, Pennsylvania, he hitchhiked a little bit further south and eventually rejoined the Appalachian Trail in a different spot, this time hiking south, heading towards Harper's Ferry. It appears that he may have even stole the story that the couple may have told him, because he told other hikers that he was a thru hiker and that he had started the trail up in Maine back in June. The same day that LaRue and Hood were killed, another couple that they had actually previously met on trail rolled into Thelma Mark's shelter, hoping to camp there for the evening. That wouldn't end up happening, however, because when they rolled up to the shelter, they became the first people to witness the carnage that Cruz had caused. They immediately turned around and hiked back to Duncannon and alerted police about what they had discovered. That night, state troopers and investigators made their way to Thelma Mark's shelter by headlight, and soon after, the next morning, all-terrain vehicles navigated their way through the forest to collect the bodies and evidence from the scene. And soon after that, investigators were looking for Paul David Cruz, although they didn't quite know his name yet. They did, however, know about the strange man that the ATC worker had seen a couple days earlier, and they knew that he was carrying red gym bags. One of these bags had been left at the murder scene, and another was found at the next shelter south, Darlington Shelter. As the families of the victims grieved, hikers along the Appalachian Trail were on high alert for anyone who looked suspicious. And it's because of this that on September 21st, Paul David Cruz was arrested before he could kill again. Some hikers had noticed that Cruz was carrying Hood's backpack, and he wasn't carrying it and the rest of his gear in a way that like a normal experienced hiker who had walked all the way from Maine would. They reported this to the police, and just as Cruz was crossing from Maryland into Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, they detained him. They searched the backpack he was wearing and uncovered additional items that belonged to LaRue and Hood. They also found a .22 caliber revolver and a long double-edged knife. Cruz was arrested, brought into custody, and eventually charged with the murders of LaRue and Hood. Prosecutors had a strong case. In addition to the stolen items and murder weapons found in Cruz's possession, they also had DNA evidence against him. However, one thing they didn't have was a motive for the crime. And the truth is, we still don't really have one even to this day. At trial, Crews' lawyers explained his actions by blaming it on a violent outburst brought on by the drugs he was taking, but that doesn't really tell us the full story. Crews himself never offered any explanation as to why he killed the innocent couple. Paul David Crews was eventually found guilty and given the death sentence in Pennsylvania. However, in 2006, this sentence was changed to life in prison, and so that's where he remained for the rest of his life. Because in July of 2022, Crews died in prison. He died of natural causes, sitting there rotting in his cell right where he belonged. In late 2002, Thelma Marks Shelter was torn down and a section of the Appalachian Trail in the area was renamed in the honor of Hood and LaRue. Now, I always get a little bit of flack when I say this, but I just want to stress that incidents like this are scary and they are real. But at the end of the day, the truth is that they're extremely, extremely rare. You're far safer on the Appalachian Trail, far, far safer than you are walking down the street of just about any city in the US, which is something that pretty much all of us do without even thinking twice about it. Please be safe out there, everybody. And also, please keep LaRue, Hood, and their families in your thoughts and in your hearts.